welcome everybody. We're the Pinedo Brothers. I'm your host, Peter, and with me I have my brother,
Hey, I'm JP.
JP, in the house. This is the Pinedo Brothers Podcast. Thanks so much for tuning back in. I know we've been on a little bit of a break, things being kind of crazy the last couple of weeks, but we're happy to be back. And today we're talking about World War One. This is the war to end all wars that we have all since forgotten. Not you won't. It doesn't get much publicity, World War One, but I think it has a lot of relevance for what's happening today and things that we're seeing all across the world. So what do you say, JP? Should we get started with that?
Let's do it.
Okay. So first off, what was World War One, and what happened? Who fought in it? I think if you were to ask this a lot, ask this to any average American, you would get kind of a completely blank stare. Because at least in my experience, World War One, has been completely overshadowed with World War Two. And people at least still have somewhat of a semblance of an idea of what happened in World War Two. Because you can think of the Nazis and Hitler. Um, the Holocaust, those kinds of things. Of course, those also are starting to vanish a little bit in our national memory, but at least there's still a little bit more of a memory in there. World War One was a similarly grand scale war, obviously by the name World War One, but it was also, like I mentioned, called the War to End All Wars, or the Final War, the Last War, which obviously we know didn't end up being the case. But the scale and sheer magnitude of the war was something that had never been before seen in the world in history. And so you can kind of understand why it was seen as the war to end all wars. What do you know much? Do you know much about World War One, JP?
Yeah, I think I probably know more than the average person, and our longtime listeners will probably recall some of my perspectives on it from previous podcasts that we've talked about. Um, I think that World War One is probably, and we've said this in previous podcast. Well, I'll link to it in the description. Is probably the closest. What's happening now is the closest reincarnation of World War One that we've got. So if you want to think about the time just previous to World War One, just put the American Empire, and as much as it is an empire, which that could be debated, but we're pretty much equal to what the British Empire was just prior to World War One, and the whole world is a tinderbox, just like it was then. But in any case, go for it.
Hmm. Well, the big thing to realize with World War One is that there's not a clear cut kind of villain bad guy as there is in World War Two. Obviously, um, Hitler, the big bad guy of World War Two, and then of course there's the other authoritarian powers like Russia coming in, the communist power there, the fascist power in Italy. A lot of those kind of very clear cut, easy to see bad guys. That's really not so much the case in World War Two. I mean, in World War One. In World War One, like you said, we have the main world power being Britain, which the sun never set on the British Empire at this point. It is the preeminent power in the world with territories in the Americas and uh, Africa, Asia, the Pacific. It is at the height of its grandeur and its power, just kind of coming out of the Victorian era, um, which it's really the top dog, and this is in an age of very vast imperialism in Europe, in which countries like Britain are the top dog, but also Spain has just ended its period of dominance. Um, but other countries in Europe as well are wanting to get a piece of that pie. France, well underway, its imperial project well underway, um, and Germany, is growing in its national identity. And this, I think, is an important thing to note here: is that um, we're coming out of the age. Really, it's kind of a coming of age story. World War One is. We're coming away from the time in which Christendom was the defining identity of the West. It was seen not so much as the West, but as Christendom, and that is what all people from the West kind of can coalesce their identity around: our shared Christian heritage and Christian faith. Um, that is what defined Europe through centuries, and then came to define the New World as well as it was colonized by Europe. This identity, this faith, that is starting to vanish at this time as the turn of the as we enter the 20th century from the 19th century. Um, it's not so much seen anymore. The Pope has in the Catholic Church, has is having less and less influence. He's losing his territories into papal states. Uh, Italy is uniting and forming kind of its own secular government. Um, I think that is a portion of World War One that really is undervalued, and how much the loss of faith really ends up leading to the first global conflict. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the first thing I think of as you were speaking, it was resounding in my ears, is that great film Chariots of Fire. And Chariots of Fire is told, in case you haven't seen it, it's a film about the British Olympic running team that took place, I would say, a few years after, maybe 10, 15 years after World War One, so pre-World War Two. Um, and there is this particular British runner who refuses to race on the Sabbath day, and because he says that that's a day for God and it's not a day for racing. And he's the best runner on the team, on this British team, and they employ all sorts of terrible pressure on him, not torture, but pressure, like, hey, this is your patriotic duty and all this different type of stuff. And there's this one British diplomat that's very frustrated, and he says, in my day, it was country first, God second. And he's just so upset. And another more thoughtful diplomat says, and the war to end all wars bloody well proved that that was worthwhile, right? it This is them looking back and seeing, like, this is not a Christian film. This is just a regular secular film that the Brits put out, looking back at this time of World War One, or in its immediate aftermath, and showing how nationalism ruled the day in Britain, and Britain wasn't alone in that. Nationalism took over, replacing Christendom, like you said, um, to a degree where it was the good of the country above all, the glory of the country above all.
Mhm.
And it was disastrous.
Yeah, and it's kind of a sense of this unbridled imperialist kind of ambition.
Mhm.
The Christendom, obviously, when it colonized Europe, has an ability to expand and to build great empires. But there's a key difference in the type of imperialism that you see beforehand, and then what you're seeing around this time, right before the start of World War One, is that it's completely untethered and untied from the ground at all of of Christianity. That's a perfect example of what you gave from Chariots of Fire. That it's God is put second. It's not a factor in these countries' ambitions. And so, kind of taking a step back, it'd be good to know who the players are in this. Like I mentioned, Britain, the main world power, but we have the rising power of Germany. We also have the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which, as you probably know, doesn't exist anymore.
You're speaking of the Austria-Hungarian Empire that doesn't exist anymore. I also want to point out that just before we move completely from the idea of nationalism and what its effects are, it's how many times, if we had a dollar for every time people say that more people have died over religious wars than have ever died, that more people have died for God than have ever died for anything else. You should just point out to what people die for when they're not dying for God and in the great quantities that they die. Um, Chesterton pointed out so well that religion actually seems to be one of the very few things that's worth dying for. And when you replace religion as in its primacy um, in people's hearts and minds, you get travesties like the 20th century and World War One and World War Two and all the other wars and the wars that we're seeing now. Um, it's it's quite terrible. But in any case,
Mhm.
I'm
Mhm.
sorry. Back to the Austrian-Hungarian Empire.
Yeah. So um, we have Britain, we have Germany, we have the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which obviously doesn't exist today. But at this time, it is basically what you could consider one of the last vestiges of the Roman Empire itself. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, ruled by the Habsburg dynasty, is a remnant of the Holy Roman Empire, which in turn is a remnant of the Roman Empire itself. Um, and so here you have, and in the 20th century, a very real, tangible connection back to the Roman Empire itself. And that's kind of giving you a picture of how this really is the true end of what was everything that came before, and the turning point towards everything that we now have today. Um, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was a vast empire, but it was completely within Europe. So a lot of Central Europe and into Eastern Europe. And it was a multi-ethnic empire, probably the most diverse um, empire in Europe at that time. It was known for being very a great degree, out of necessity, a great degree of tolerance and, like I said, very diverse in terms of ethnicity as well as culture and even religion.
Very
So we,
Jewish, I might point out.
hmm hmm but also granting the fact that it was a Catholic empire, with
Hmm.
the Habsburgs being a Catholic dynasty.
Hmm.
Um, and so then we cannot, of course, forget France, which had an empire stretching across the world as well, not to the scale of Britain, but still quite significant and quite impressive in terms of scale and power. And then we have at this point Russia, which is still ruled by the Tsars, the Russian Caesars. Um, and still an absolute monarchy, but that is starting to fail, and to starting that grip on the country is starting to loosen. Um, and so that kind of gives you a picture of the main powers there in Europe at the time.
So you
Um,
wouldn't call the Ottoman Empire or Turkey the Turks? Would that be one of the? In my mind, I thought they would be up there too. What do you think, though?
yeah, I wouldn't say that they were, super. Obviously, they're very important to the world at the time, and also important to the war. But not I wouldn't call them one of the main players. I
Got it.
think that
Got it.
those kind of powers really set the stage for what everything that
Cool.
happens. What they, of course, yeah. Thank you for reminding me. That's good to include them there, because um, they rule all the Middle East, and large parts
Okay.
of Africa, Northern Africa as well, and of course, the part what is today Greece and Turkey. So the Ottomans there, a major Muslim empire amidst all
Mhm.
these traditionally Christian empires. Um, and that's important to know too, because we'll get to it, and when we get to the conflict. But this also sets the stage for what we see with going on in Israel today. So very important. Am I leaving any points of confusion, or what else have I missed in there in that description?
I think those are the main powers that you've got, and then there's Italy that's forming that you mentioned already, and the Kaisers up in Germany. I think they're all the players are there as far as I can remember. Spain, poor Spain, is not really a power at this point, as much as its grandeur was felt in the previous iterations of the Spanish Empire. Portugal, uh, a lot of the lowlands region, Denmark, Norway are also kind of smaller, or bits and pieces of that are a part of other empires. So yeah, I think you've set the stage really well. I love it.
Hmm. Well, and I think a big thing to also remember is that a lot of these countries are now moving towards democratic systems. And as Americans, I think we think automatically, oh, that's great, that's good. Everyone's becoming more democratic. That's a good thing. Not necessarily here in Europe at this time, um, because you can kind of look to these countries as they become more democratic. um, it's oftentimes a bit more oligarchic instead of having a one king or ruling family as you do in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. You have instead one central governing system that can exert a lot more influence and power on the day-to-day lives of its citizens than a king ever could. And so we have this tendency to think automatically, oh, that's great. Democracy is better. And I think democracy is a better system, but sometimes in practice, not so much.
Mm.
Because, like I said, Austro-Hungarian Empire, probably the most culturally diverse and tolerant empire at the time, and also the most one still rooted in the old ways of monarchy um, and family dynasties. So it's kind of a funny, difficult concept to grasp for us as Americans.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, definitely. Us
mm,
Americans, we know so little ultimately. We always project our same love of democracy on all countries, and it doesn't really fit everywhere.
yeah, not yeah, it doesn't necessarily transfer to all societies and all places and all times. So that's something I think to remember now. Uh, just taking going into foreign policy, if we're
Yep.
uh, as Americans thinking about the world, we have that tendency to project it into all other places, but it's not. It's not always the case, and very often isn't. So, how did World War One start? Well, um, it started with all of these tendencies, these nationalist movements, these imperialistic movements. So you get very much what we get today is that it's the world is a whole powder keg just waiting for a match to set it off. So there is one singular event that historians point to the start of World War One, but really this event could have been anything else. It could have been 100 other things just as well as it was this. The crown prince, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, who was a political rival of his own father, the ruling uh, emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They were actually political rivals. Um, so not a whole lot of love lost between the two of them. He was assassinated along with his wife by a terrorist in the Balkan regions, which is close to Greece. Um, doing a royal tour of the area. Um, he's in a royal parade down one of the towns, and he is all of a sudden a assassin jumps out and shoots him point blank. um, and he dies very soon after. And so this event here ends up setting off a chain reaction across first Europe and then the whole world, um, which every time, it always makes me think every time that, Hamas hits, does a terrorist attack in Israel, or Russia crosses into Ukraine, uh, or Armenians are getting uh, ethnically cleansed from their homeland. Each time this happens, I'm kind of looking at it and thinking, is this the Franz Ferdinand assassination that's about to ignite the powder keg? What do you think? Am I
Well,
leaving you going too quickly here?
I
Go
think
ahead.
of it very often whenever we
Hmm.
have like President Biden or a U.S. politician visit Israel and Hamas is bombing Israel while it's going on. I think what happens if one gets through?
Hmm.
Um, it's World War III. I mean, maybe it's possible it wouldn't turn into World War III, but it probably would if something like that happens. So it's very present in my mind how near of a thing we have going on right now. Our
Hmm.
beautiful civilization that we've built might erupt.
Yeah, and the world is very fragile, and that's something that I think Christians, we luckily do have a, a better understanding of, in that we don't root our hope and our trust in today in the worldly powers, because we do understand that um, that it's a very fragile system in which we are built in. And like living here in DC, everything, when you go to the National Mall and you're in the area where all the government, seats of government are, everything is made of marble and stone, and it's huge and grand and impressive and beautiful. Um, and that's it's good that it is, but there's going to come a day when none of it is left standing. And hopefully, I think as an American, and I hope that it is not a day when I'm alive, still alive, and I hope that it's not when my children are alive, but it is undeniable that there will come a day when, the greatest structures that we have here will not be left standing. So that's a little morbid note for you. But you see this happen, this chain event, this chain reaction happens. Franz Ferdinand is assassinated, which makes Austria-Hungary. They have to avenge the death of their crown prince. They move in, which then prompts Russia to invade um, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Um, Germany jumps in to the aid of its ally Austria-Hungary, goes and starts invading France, which then brings in Britain, and ultimately, of course, eventually America joins in as well. And so conflict erupts throughout the world. And this is it's difficult, I think, to convey. And I think there have been a few um, movies that have come out recently that have done a better job at kind of communicating what World War I actually meant to the people of the time. What comes to mind is 1917. I think it's a great portrayal of World War I, because this is the first time in which modern warfare is seen on a global scale. You're I think more of an American historian than I am, so I think you studied the Civil War a good bit, and that's kind of you can point to that as well, if I'm not mistaken, as one of the first examples of more modern style warfare. Um, but here you have on the world stage thousands and thousands of the world's young men being fed to be slaughtered by the world's new technologies, the new war machines, which had we had really no concept or understanding of. And at the beginning of World War I, soldiers would try riding horses across the battle lines and get mowed down by machine guns. So that's really just kind of pointing to the disconnect between what we understood to be warfare before to what it had now become without us really realizing it. Um, and so when you think of World War I, you think of the trenches, the machine guns, the mustard gas, these horrific things, um, which had never really been seen before at all. And this, I think, really has a radical shift on the world. And I think we still kind of see it today. We still have this almost, I would say, long, protracted, horrified kind of scream. I think um, what is that piece? Is I think it's called The Scream, that piece of art that
Yeah, by Edward Munch.
that kind of I'm not sure when what do we know what year that was he did that? Do you have any idea?
It would have been after World War I. I'll pull it up real quick.
Yeah, and I think this really portrays the horror of um
Oh wait, no,
the
it's
horror of the
before
war.
1893.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah,
1893.
but obviously this is an image that's popularized after the war, and as well as you can point to many other different artists. A lot you can think of a lot of British artists who were young men in the war who somehow survived the war, but came back completely decimated by what they had seen and experienced. And um, this is a time when lots of things start becoming untethered. And one of my favorite TV shows is Downton Abbey, and it's a very posh and proper show. But it does also kind of portray some of the unwinding of civilization, the winding of culture, in which World War One changes people's understanding and perception of what the world is and what um, tradition means. And very shortly after seeing the horrors of the modern war machine, it's difficult to hold on to the truth and the beauty which we had such a great understanding of beforehand. And so I would kind of posit that that's kind of really the main takeaway from World War One. You know, in the end, empires fell. Uh, Great Britain was never again what it once was. Austro-Hungarian Empire was wiped off the map completely. Um, Germany was defeated and humiliated, but of course, as we know, ended up rising again with a vengeance. And then in the Russian Empire, um, the the um, the monarchs ended up falling, and communists taking over and that wreaking havoc on millions of Russians there. Um, all of that aside, the main takeaway I think from this is that it it leaves this horrified kind of unprecedented scale of pain on the world. And that shifts everything. And that kind of leads to a lot of the problems that we see and face today. And so you can see it in the art from the time, and then still from in much of the art that we have today. Um, and also you see it in Catholicism as well. But before I get too ahead of myself, I want to ask, what do you think?
Yeah, it's horrific. The first thing that comes to mind, actually, though, is comparing it to World War III. If World War III happens, and every day it seems like we get closer to that, the the same sort of jump in technology is what we would experience now, because the last real powers going at it, just like all these powers, were peers. They were equals, really, as far as might and technology goes. The last time that happened was World War II. I mean, that's almost we're coming up on 100 years, in another decade or two. So technology has changed dramatically since then, and we're going to be learning what two powers going against it is going to look like. Um, And I hope that's a lesson that we can be spared from, and this generation and our next generations can be spared from. But one thing that World War One definitively taught us, in that World War Two happened, was that there is no such thing as a war that ends all wars. So eventually it'll probably happen. I just hope we're spared, our generations are spared. Um, because yeah, it's a horrendous lesson. It's a lesson in horror that we wish to avoid for ourselves and our children.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Um, but I do think, of course, there's always hopeful notes to be taken away. Um, and the church did stand strong, I think, amidst this. We had some of the, um, probably some of the best popes that came after World War One, that arose in the face of all this horror. And um, obviously, in every age, the church has flaws and there's problems. But I think it did remain as a kind of a bastion of Christendom, a bastion of hope amidst a society really caught in this scream and this horror. Um, and I think at this point you can kind of say that Christianity and Catholicism, it starts becoming a little bit countercultural in the society and culture that it built. you know, Today we kind of oftentimes accept that Christianity is countercultural. Just on some of the most basic uh, tendencies of society that are widely accepted by culture, in which the church and Christianity at large says no, that's wrong. Um, this is a point when, on a grand scale, the church starts becoming um, kind of an outcast in its own society. Um, so that's another interesting note there. But I do want to kind of tie it in, like we've already begun to, but tie it in a little bit to what we're seeing today. This especially with Israel, is a big kind of the after effect of all that happened in World War One. Um, do you? I want to get your thoughts on what you think the connection is before I kind of give any more of my opinion.
Um, well, I know that Israel was formed as a state after World War II, kind of in response to World War II. At least that's what I'm aware of. Um, I know that World War One, there was a lot of nation forming. Um, Woodrow Wilson went off with his map and reshaped a lot of things to the great detriment of everything he touched. Um, but I'm not too familiar of the immediate impact of World War One in Israel, so you'll have to fill me in on that.
Hmm. Well, I mean, of course, there's the Balfour Declaration, which, for those not familiar with, is a declaration from the British Empire to Jews who, at this time, were really pushing for what they call the Zionist movement, to establish a homeland for Jews in their ancestral homeland, Israel, and where the kingdom of David was. Um, in this Balfour Declaration, it essentially says that the British government um, will cede the land to the Jews and allow them to return there and establish their own state, in which they have the guaranteed right of obviously of religion, and to be able to express their religion and culture without worry, because at this time you have those currents and those movements now untethered by the what before had the church had been this force that had been able to kind of hold back those tendencies. um, Now that's become thrown aside. And so this tendency towards anti-Semitism and other things like that are now completely um, unbinded and and running amok, and obviously that's what leads to the Nazis and to Hitler. Um, so it's kind of always this domino effect. Um, but I don't want to get onto too many different topics, but I do want to talk about what we can learn from it. Um, so let's say this. if if there was one thing that you would take away from all this discussion and about World War I, about the world that we're seeing today, what would it be?
Um, well, I have questions actually. I'd love to ask you more about the Balfour Declaration because I'm not
Mm,
super knowledgeable of it, and I want to learn more. And I imagine our listeners would probably be very interested in that as well. But just to respond to your immediate question, I would
mhm,
say that the first thing we have to remember is that uh, dedication to, I think of Jordan Peterson's abandoned ideology. There's a lot of ideologies going on right now. And what seemed to capture the world at this time was this ideology of nation that overtook everything, overtook
mm,
the image of God. Nietzsche was talking about God's death, and his blood will not his blood now runs like rivers through the streets, and it shall not be washed away. That is, you know, predicting everything that the 20th century wound up being. And we left our God to adhere to some ideology, an ideology of this glorious state. And now we have different ideologies that are growing. They're more religious, perhaps, than nationalism, but that doesn't make them less dangerous. Their religion, maybe they're less, I don't like using that term. They're more spiritual. They're more spiritual. They're probably less religious even than nationalism, but they're more spiritual in that they're more mysterious and dogmatic in the worst possible way. Um, these woke ideologies that we see that are starting to transmute themselves all over the world. Um, so I would say caution us against these ideologies and look towards something that is stronger. That's more of a core principle of ours because those core principles transfer across nations and peoples. And also a knowledge of history. If we see that things are repeating themselves, perhaps we need to study more and find out how they're repeating, and maybe we can try and avoid it. I think history is uh, a good tutor in that regard. So I think those would be the two that I take away. How about you?
yeah, no, I totally agree, and I think you draw a great parallel, which we hadn't talked about too much before, was that um, in World War I, you do have this rising new ideology of nationalism and imperialism, unfettered and untied by religion. And now we have another rising ideology, which is kind of that woke tendency to even reject what had arisen during World War I, which was Western culture, the idea of a Western culture. Now we reject that because again, it's still tied into that the Christian world and the Christian culture in which was built by the church. Um, and so we're at a time again when there's a lot of different world powers, a lot of different things happening. Um, but we're becoming amidst all that, the risk is that we're becoming untethered to our own stake of ourselves, and of course a great way to hold on to that is by our understanding and knowledge of history, understanding what happened, as well as of holding on to our faith. We can't, that it's something that we easily throwing aside, but you think of it on a national scale and also on a global scale, it has an actual impact.
Absolutely. So tell me more about this Balfour Declaration. So it happened, it was said by the British Empire after World War I, you said. And what was the reasoning? And the reasoning, for if I heard you correctly, was because the growing anti-Jewish sentiment, which was seeping through all these nation states, and they wished to create a spot. So they were trying to be helpful to the Jewish people. Was that the thought?
Yes. So yes and no. I mean, this is something. There's always multiple different motives for things that happen. The idea is to be helpful for them to, and that's why the Zionist movement was growing, because out of reaction to um, growing persecution and just kind of continual persecution that had been going for a long time. And so there's this movement that is called, the Zionist movement to establish a Jewish homeland. Um, and eventually, the British government, it's in 1917 when it was signed, um, does agree to help the Jewish people establish this homeland. And this is what was then kind of the Ottoman Empire, because they had taken over much of the Middle East, and they had taken over the Holy Land. Um, and so, like, that's kind of that gives you a bit of a window into understanding the current conflict, in that Palestinians, Muslim, people of Arabic um, origin, claim that this is their homeland, that they were there before the Jews, which, from a certain point of view, you could say that, I guess, that's true. I guess the modern state of Israel was only founded in the 1900s, but at the same time, has always, throughout history, been the Jewish homeland. There have always been a Jewish presence in the Holy Land, and and they've been there for thousands and thousands of years. Um, so the Balfour Declaration is a big piece of what ended up leading to the modern nation state of Israel.
And with the Balfour Declaration, though, was that really acted upon prior to World War II? My understanding is things were really formed post World War II in that energy. But
Mhm.
did I have that mixed up?
No, no, you're correct. Yeah, because the Balfour Declaration, they made it in 1917, and that kind of put it into law, as this is what the British government was committing itself to. But um, like many governments do, the government they made a promise and they didn't actually act on it or fill it until much longer after that.
Right. The Ottomans, who are of Muslim, persuasion, not not Christian, like you mentioned earlier, and if they are holding sway over this territory, I'm sure that the Balfour Declaration had very little actual practical effect unless the British, pushed the Ottomans out. But the Ottomans didn't really crumble until later, correct? Or am I getting that?
I know that the Ottoman influence was definitely crumbling at this point. So I would have to look it up to see what year they ended up kind of collapsing. But
Yeah.
this is a time when they're very distracted in their in the Caucasus region, and they're really not in their expansive mode anymore. They're not
Right.
growing. They're kind of collapsing in on themselves.
And that's key. I think understanding what's going on in the Middle East is very important to right now. We want to understand how World War III might happen. Um, the Ottomans, they were the receivers of the whirlwind in the desert that took place, that pushed out the 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 empire of Constantine from this area. It was the Constantine's Roman Empire that ruled from Constantinople, also ruled the Holy Land up until the medieval age. And then it was a response to the whirlwind in the desert that the Crusades took place to push them away. And so, what we look at with the Ottoman Empire is the receivership of that control after the Crusades. The spirit of the Crusades had been spent, and the blood had been spent of the Crusades. Um, And so, the Ottomans were not initially the receivers of that, but they became that. However, the Jewish state existed in this area up until Rome destroyed it, prior to the Ottomans, prior to the whirlwind in the desert, when Israel revolted against Rome. And if you don't, if you go up against the king, you best not miss. And Rome was the king, and Israel did not succeed in its revolt. And so Rome let no stone on top of another in the temple. Um, but that was far prior, hundreds of years prior to the Muslims inheriting this land, um, after the spirit of the Crusades had failed. Or failed is a strong word, but had been spent. So Israel, if you're looking at ancestral homes, Israel has the best claim to this by far. Um, and it's important to remember at least a little bit of how the Genesis came about, especially now. But did I have that straight?
Yeah, no, you absolutely do.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's
That's
something
good.
to recall for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll have to keep that in mind and in prayer. I'm sorry. I hope our listeners, thank you for allowing me to ask questions from you. I hope our listeners found it interesting. I did too.
No, absolutely. Um, well, I do want to make sure that we did you have any other questions before? Because we
No,
are running a little bit low on time. Okay.
no.
Um, so I think again the main takeaway is kind of the importance of faith and how we I've been hearing this a lot lately about I think with our new Speaker of the House, Rep Mike Johnson from Louisiana. People are talking about how it's terrible that he's publicly praying inside the House of Representatives, and that he mentioned God so much in his entry speech, and how it's, it needs to be separation of church and state. And I think my response to that is that, separation of church and state means that there's no one religion that's established that will mandated to practice, but that by no means uh, has to mean that you can't practice your religion in public, or that you can't practice it if you're a member of the state. Praying in public in the House of Representatives was has always been seen as a good thing in the United States until very recently, I think. Um, and I think if we continue to kind of, if we even are just embarrassed by people saying, "Oh, look at that! This is the violating the separation of church and state." If we look at our leaders, a leader who has the courage to pray publicly in the Capitol, if we're embarrassed by that, then we're really feeding into the mentality that leads to things like World War I, that leads
Mhm.
to this complete untethering from political life and from just ordinary life, from our faith. The faith is what keeps atrocities and terrible things from happening. Um, it's a force for such great good in the world.
Absolutely.
So, um,
Absolutely. And we need to push back. I think we need to stop using that term separation of church and state. That immediately puts us wrong-footed. And it's nowhere in any of our founding documents, that term. What the Constitution says is Congress shall make no law regarding the establishment of religion. Therefore, what is a better term to use is that Congress shall not interrupt religion. That should we say. Congress, the state shall not interrupt religion. The state shall not interrupt church. The state shall not dictate church to us. That is what should be said. But it's not inversely true. The church should be interrupting the state at all times. Our religion should be brought in to the state in all things, just like the founding fathers have in their founding documents, many times referencing God and the Bible. So let's get rid of this terrible separation of church and state phrase that people use to destroy our state.
mhm, yeah. Absolutely. Well, we're about out of time, but I do want to just do a quick take. Like we like to add in a little bit of a something going on in the art or the cultural world, and just give our little thoughts on it. There's things I wanted to talk about real quickly. Um, I don't know. The first one, have you heard of JP? Have you heard of an artist named Jake? Which I think it's actually he spells his name weird. It's like JVKE or something like that, but they say Jake. Have you heard of this guy?
I just now when you said it, I googled it. I'm reading about him now. You lead the way out.
Yeah. So we'll give this song a listen. He has a song called Golden Hour, which I wanted to give him a shout out and a little bit of respect for him. I don't know what he's like as a really as an artist or as a person at all, but I was pleasantly surprised when I heard his song because this, well, for one thing, this is a song that's really popular on TikTok right now. From my understanding, it's used in a lot of different TikToks. Um, but the song actually has a lot of talent. He has a great voice, and he uses the thing that really stood out to me from the couple of songs that I listened to him was that he uses the piano a lot. He plays the piano and he sings, and you can kind of tell that he at least has some classical training and appreciation of kind of classical piano, which is really awesome to see kind of breaking through into the mainstream, uh, even TikTok kind of world. So respect for Jake and the Golden Hour song and a couple of other songs that I heard of his, which were really good. I think it's important to have artists that are still kind of rooted in the classical tradition music that came before. Oftentimes the pop music today just is kind of um, purposely provocative,
Mm.
and it wants in both its lyrics and in its the music itself is provocative in a way that it's actively trying to reject what came before. And that's not what I'm hearing in this song at all. I think it's kind of drawing from those traditions. So, hats off to this guy. I think it's an awesome song.
Yeah, just reading this one verse. For the love of my life, she's got glow on her face, a glorious look in her eyes, my angel of light. That's beautiful. And it speaks on many different levels, not just to your spouse or your girlfriend, but also to the love of your life in God or your passion that you pursue. It's something I'm not used to reading of lyrics in poetry in modern day pop music. So
Yeah.
I'm glad to turn on. I can't wait to listen to this. Thanks for putting it on my radar.
Yeah. And whether or not it's a great song. I mean, I think it's an awesome song. There's such an easy market difference when you could so easily spot like when someone's actually rooted in some type of tradition, and you see it in the lyrics, in the music, and everything. And it's very refreshing to see. And then the other thing I wanted to mention real quick is I was listening, I think, to another podcast, and um, a it was a video. They were talking about a video of Greta Thunberg, the environmental activist who hates the West, um, and she was criticizing the Israeli war and because it wasn't green enough. And then it just it was getting more increasingly ridiculous. And then I realized that it was actually an AI video or a deep fake.
Oh,
Um, yeah. And so that's another thing I wanted to mention too, that the growing prevalence of AI and deep fakes on culture and on art is making it more and more difficult to really understand and know what's happening. Um, and so I think that's something that maybe we have explored some, or at least you did, speaking with a couple of people on some other podcasts. So maybe we can link to that one as well.
that
Um,
sounds great.
but that will be a topic to continue monitoring, especially its effect on culture and on art. So that's something to keep in mind in the future. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that's about it for today. Thanks for joining us, everyone, and thanks for sticking with us through this history lesson. I always I love talking about history with you, JP. So thanks for sticking with me. And unless there's anything else, I think we're going to go ahead and close it out, and we'll see you all next week. Thanks for joining us. We're the Pinedo Brothers. See you next time.